Hi, I'm Gary Ralph, and this is another in the series of lectures that I'm doing for videotaping for History 101, Europe and the World Part 1, and this is Part 3 of my lecture on some aspects of the Renaissance. I was telling you before that there are representative people in the Renaissance who are very Christian. So just because the people in the Renaissance were paying a lot of attention to the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans doesn't mean they were rejecting Christianity. Some people did, and I will get to those in a minute. But first I want to talk about people like Desiderius Erasmus, a Dutch scholar. And he was doing the same kind of thing that Petrarch was doing. He was comparing texts and trying to figure out where the mistakes were and how to correct them so that they would be more like the original. Erasmus devoted himself to coming up with an authoritative text of the New Testament. And in fact, the version of the New Testament that he published, he compared a lot of manuscripts of the New Testament, and there were a lot of them by his time, and determined what the real texts were. And actually, by the time that Erasmus was working, we did have the printing press, which was invented around 1450. So when Erasmus came up with his edition of the New Testament, it could be published and was distributed all over Europe and became sort of the standard go-to text if you wanted a copy of the New Testament that didn't have any mistakes in it, or at least according to Erasmus, he got rid of all the mistakes. So Erasmus was famous for that in sort of the same way Petrarch had been famous for it a couple of centuries before. But Erasmus was also a creative writer, and he wrote a book called The Praise of Folly, which was very popular at the time. And I've got a copy of it in my library. In translation, it was written in Latin. And it's a funny book. It's actually quite amusing to read. The kind of setup that Erasmus gives for the book is that it's a speech in praise of folly, and the speech is being given by the personification of folly, or folly meaning silliness, craziness, stupidity. And the person who's giving the speech is a woman who is the sort of the representation of folly, which is kind of, I guess, an anti-female thing. But she talks about all of the silly, crazy things that people do in the world. Now, let me see if I can find my copy of the text. I have a passage over here. Okay. I have, in your textbook, in your source book on page 25, I have a couple of pages from The Praise of Folly. And I'll read a little bit of it just to give you, I'm not going to read the whole 2 pages. The gist of the speech is that folly is such a wonderful thing because it makes people happy. When they're being silly and stupid, they are enjoying themselves. And Erasmus says, the happiness of these people is most nearly approached by those who are popularly called religious or monks, people who live in monasteries. Both names are false, since most of them are a long way removed from religion. And whenever you go, these so-called solitaries, remember the monks were people who had supposedly removed themselves from society, these so-called solitaries are the people you're likely to meet. I don't believe any life would be more wretched than theirs if I, Folly, didn't come to their aid in many ways. The whole tribe is so universally loathed that even a chance meeting is thought to be ill-omened. In other words, if you see a monk, it's sort of bad luck, like if you were to see a black cat. And yet they were gloriously self-satisfied. In the first place, they believe it's the highest form of piety to be so uneducated that they can't even read. And that was not supposed to be what monks were like, but Erasmus is saying that in his day, most monks were quite ignorant. Then when they bray like donkeys in church, repeating by rote the psalms that they haven't understood, they imagine that they are charming the ears of their heavenly audience with infinite delight. Many of them, too, make a good living out of their squalor and beggary, bellowing for bread from door to door, and indeed making a nuisance of themselves in every inn, carriage, or boat, to the great loss of all the other beggars. In fact, they are just among people who were various kinds of people who were asking rich people for money and things like that. This is the way in which these smooth individuals, in all their filth and ignorance, their boorish and shameless behavior, claim to bring back the apostles into our midst. So Erasmus, who is a representative of the church, is really coming down hard on monks and criticizing them. It's not the only group that he criticizes. I'm one of the things I am is a historian of hunting, because I am a historian of firearms and weapons. And he really makes fun of the hunters who are like, they're out there killing the animals who are not much stupider than they are themselves, and then they don't even eat the meat. They're just doing it for fun. So you think, Erasmus is really down on the Christian church. He is down on the Christian church as it existed in his time. But the end of the book is very interesting. At the end he says, when I talk about all of these people who are representatives of folly, all these people who are silly, and he says at the end, the silliest of all are the Christians, because the Christians don't do anything for themselves. They only do things for other people. They don't try to make a lot of money. They live in humble circumstances. They follow this rule of, if somebody slaps you on the cheek, you turn and let them slap you on the other cheek. What could be sillier than that? Of course, what Erasmus is really saying in a kind of ironic way is that those are the only ones who are not silly at all. Those are the ones who are being the true Christians. And he's calling them representatives of folly in a kind of affectionate way, and saying, the real message that you carry away, it's an unmistakable message at the end, is that these are the people you should really try to be like, because they're not silly at all. They are the ones who are the real Christians, whom we should all emulate. So, he is not an anti-Christian Renaissance figure. He is supporting Christianity, and he's in fact supporting a kind of Christianity that he doesn't see being practiced much. Interestingly enough, when the Reformation comes, and he's still alive during the Reformation, Erasmus's reactions, wait a minute, I didn't mean this. I didn't mean you should break away from the Church of Rome. You should be better Christians, but you should be better Christians within the context of the Roman Church. So he doesn't quite go as far as people like Martin Luther and people like that. One of Erasmus's good buddies was an Englishman named Thomas More, an important official in the court of the King of Henry VIII of England, another figure that we'll talk about in my lectures on the Reformation. Thomas More, in fact, he was the High Chancellor of England. I don't think he was specifically a religious figure, but when Henry the VIII started issuing his acts of supremacy, which were meant to make Henry VIII the head of the Christian Church in England rather than the Pope, More basically said, I'm not going to do that. And I'm not going to argue that anybody should do that. And he eventually is executed. His head is cut off by Henry VIII. Not personally, I don't think, but Henry VIII has him executed. So More was not only a Christian, but he was somebody who was standing up very staunchly for the kind of Christianity that he believed in. And More is another important example or illustration of Renaissance thought. The book that he's probably most famous for having written is a book called Utopia. And in fact, that's where we get the word utopia. When we talk about some real place or fictional place where everything's perfect and everybody's happy and nothing ever goes wrong, we refer to it as a utopia. The Latin word actually means no place, or a place that doesn't exist. So it's a fantasy. The book is, again, it's told in a kind of first-person way. The setup is that the person who's telling the story says, the other day I went into a bar and I sat down next to this guy who looked like he was from a foreign country. And I said, "Oh, where are you from?" And the other guy says, "Well, I'm from this land called Utopia," and starts describing the way the government is organized, the way the economy is organized. In some ways, it's not the kind of place that you would want to live. I mean, it's sort of like Plato's description of the perfect republic. It's like, is that really what you think is perfect? But both Plato and Thomas More are arguing that although people as they are now, who are the way that you and I am would not like living in there. People who have, adjusted their ideals and adjusted their goals so that they can live in a place like this are going to be happy, because it's a kind of government and a kind of society that is organized so as to make everybody happy. As I say, it's an attempt to design the perfect government. This is Renaissance partly because More is doing the same thing that Plato was doing. He's, instead of just looking at the world and saying, "Oh, this is the way things are, but God must have intended it this way, so don't ask questions, just obey your king," both Plato and More were trying to use human reason to come up with a better way, and saying, we don't just have to accept the government that we have. We can use human reason to create a government that will be better. It wouldn't necessarily be like More's Utopia, but the whole point is that More is trying to create, by human reason, a government that will make people happy, with the idea that we might have that. If we chose, we might have that kind of government. So that, in that way, he's very typical of the Renaissance. Finally, I want to discuss a figure that is very controversial even today, Niccolò Machiavelli, an Italian writer. Born a little earlier than Thomas More, but I'm taking him a little bit outside of chronological order because he makes such a wonderful subject to wrap it up with. Machiavelli lived in Italy during a huge, very destruction invasion of Italy by Charles VIII of France. Charles VIII of France, I mentioned earlier that we don't really know whether gunpowder firearms were used in the 100 Years' War. By the time that Charles VIII invaded Italy, we know, because Charles VIII had these bronze cannon that were lightweight and could be transported all over the battlefield, and he's able to blow down the city walls that have been built to protect the Italian cities, and at least in the short term, it's incredibly destructive. So Machiavelli addresses himself to the problem of how we can avoid having this happen again. And he says one of the things that we can do is have rulers who rule in a very, what you might call, pragmatic, practical fashion. And he writes a book. He writes several books, including a book called The Art of War, which has some interesting things to say about military technique. He writes a book called Il Principe, or The Prince. And this is not about a particular prince, but he's saying this is what a prince should be like. And he has some very controversial things. In the last page of your source book, I've quoted some of the things that he says. For instance, how praiseworthy it is for a prince to keep his word and to live by integrity and not by deceit, everyone knows. Nevertheless, one sees from the experience of our times that the princes who have accomplished great deeds are those who have cared little for keeping their promises and who have known how to manipulate the minds of men by shrewdness. And in the end, they have surpassed those who laid their foundations upon honesty, in the sense that they have surpassed these guys by succeeding where those who laid their foundations upon honesty have failed. You must therefore know that there are two means of fighting, one according to the laws, the other with force. The first way is proper to man, the second to beasts. But because the first, in many cases, is not sufficient, it becomes necessary to have recourse to the second. In other words, it's always nice to be a man, but if being a man doesn't work, be a beast. Therefore, a prince must know how to use wisely the natures of the beast and the man. Then going on, he says, since then a prince must know how to make good use of the nature of the beast, he should choose from among the beasts the fox and the lion. For the lion cannot defend itself from traps, and the fox cannot protect itself from wolves. It is therefore necessary to be a fox in order to recognize the traps, and a lion in order to frighten the wolves. Those who play only the part of the lion do not understand matters. A wise ruler, therefore, cannot and should not keep his word when such an observance of faith would be to his disadvantage, and when the reasons which made him promise are removed. In other words, he made a promise, but now the things that made him promise are no longer holding true, so he really doesn't have to keep his promise any longer. And if men were all good, this rule would not be good. But since men are a sorry lot and will not keep their promises to you, you likewise need not keep yours to them. A prince never lacks legitimate reasons to break his promises. Wow. And in other words, what he's saying is, in order to be a good prince, you don't necessarily have to obey moral laws, because the important thing is not to be moral. The important thing is to protect your people. And this, has led to the idea that what Machiavelli is preaching is the idea that the end justifies the means. People have sometimes stated this as a kind of summation of Machiavelli's thought. And while it's, he never actually does say that, and it's only true in a limited way, what Machiavelli is saying that, yes, the end is to save your people, to prevent something like Charles VIII's invasion of Italy and everybody getting killed. Because if Charles VIII comes in and everybody gets killed, you can sit there and say, well, at least I did the right thing. But your subjects are all going to be dead. So Machiavelli says the most important thing for a prince to do is to keep the peace and protect his people and prevent enemies from attacking and killing everybody. And if you have to break a few laws, well, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. And people, for centuries since, have looked back at Machiavelli and says, well, in a way you're right, but what about morality? What about, the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you? And it's interesting, I think. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about the way some people think about the Renaissance. Nowhere in any of Machiavelli's writings does he ever refer to God. I think it's probably pretty clear that Machiavelli did not believe in God. And in that way, he's a representative of this view of the Renaissance that people have, where people say, oh, the Renaissance thinkers were throwing God over the side of the boat. But that doesn't mean that Machiavelli is not moral. And I think that the ultimate goal of Machiavelli's thinking is moral. He's saying, what you should worry about not so much is, if you want to be a good ruler, you shouldn't worry so much about morality, and you should worry about what you can do in order to make the lives of your subjects happy lives, where they can wake up in the morning and feel pretty assured that they're not going to be dead before evening. And if you have to break a few laws to do that and do a few things that people would consider morally inappropriate, then go ahead and do them, because in order to save your people's lives, you've got to sometimes do something that doesn't look morally appropriate. And, there's no simple answer to this question. People are still, in later centuries, in the 1500s and 1600s, the word Machiavellian began to be used to describe people who were not morally based, people who were sort of looking out for the main chance and doing what they thought would be best for them, and lying and cheating and breaking rules in order to accomplish what they wanted to accomplish. And it was generally considered to be a nasty thing to say about somebody, to say that they were Machiavellian. But Machiavelli was, in a sense, he was on the side of the angels, even if he didn't believe in angels. He was somebody who wanted everybody to be happy and was interested in the way to accomplish that goal. We see an interesting later example of this in the 1700s, in the Enlightenment, with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who basically wanted to create a world where everybody would be happy, the same way that Thomas More did, for instance. And both Machiavelli and Rousseau had very controversial ideas about how to achieve that goal. But Machiavelli is, for good or ill, one of the great representatives of the Renaissance. And I'm going to end with him now. Your next lecture will be about the Reformation, which talks about the Renaissance and about some of the figures in the Renaissance, like Pico della Mirandola. And after that lecture on the Reformation, we're going to talk a little bit more about the Renaissance from a scientific point of view, from the people like Galileo and Descartes. So see you there then. Bye.